Hi everyone, this is just a short video that's going to give you some broad reminders about behaviors, especially as we are in week 2 of our course, getting more specific to not only the kinds of needs related to having or displaying behaviors, but when we're thinking about students with ASD or autism spectrum disorder or autism. So just a very short set of slides giving you some important reminders, most of this being review, but an opportunity for us to think about this so that we can start to apply this information and knowledge to do something and make some good connections in the coming weeks. So one of the things we want to just first broadly remember is that behavior, for many, we consider it a type or a form of communication. And what we mean by that is when a student is engaging in some type of behavior that we can see and observe, that student is saying something through the behavior that they're displaying. And in our FBA process that we might use in, let's say, an applied behavior analysis therapy, or when we're trying to understand the function, so the functional behavior analysis, when we're analyzing the function of a behavior, that process allows us to focus on what we think are the reasons for the behavior rather than the behavior itself. So if you just take that moment to understand that through observing a behavior, you can try to understand what might be being communicated. And when we think about ABA and understanding of the functions of behavior, it's really crucial for developing effective strategies to address the behaviors that we know students will have, because it actually addresses the underlying reasons of those behaviors. And behavior function, for that quick definition, is the purpose or reason behind a specific behavior that a student or a person engages in. And when we spend time trying to identify the function of that behavior, we can get some insights and knowledge into what might be motivating the person to engage in those certain behaviors, or what it is they might be communicating about their needs. So I will say, for the most part, we have the understanding when we learn about the FBA process or learning about the functions of behaviors. I think it's widely understood that there are 4 main functions of behavior. And I'll remind us of those 4, but then I'll ultimately, you see on this slide, they kind of boil down to 2 primary functions if you really want to get to the essence of it. So let's just think in thinking of the 4 functions that we maybe have learned about behavior. One is escape avoidance. One is attention seeking. One is access to tangible items. And one is automatic reinforcement. So escape avoidance is when an individual is engaging in a behavior to maybe try to get away from a task or a situation that they maybe don't want to engage in. It could be challenging, it could be demanding. And when we think of those things, we're giving a reason, for why they're avoiding it, as opposed to just saying the function appears to be escape avoidance, right? Or it could be an aversive situation. But by engaging in a behavior, they then find a way to successfully essentially remove themselves from that unwanted situation or task. In attention-seeking behavior, the attention-seeking behaviors serve the function of, as it says, gaining attention or social interaction from others. So students might engage in behaviors like talking loudly or interrupting or disruptive behaviors with the purpose or intent to capture the attention of others around them, because that's what they're trying to seek. If we're thinking of the third one, access to tangible items, this is a behavior that's motivated by trying to gain access to something specific. So that might look like reaching or grabbing or pointing for an object of desire. Versus the fourth one is automatic reinforcement behavior. And we see this a lot with autism as behaviors that are inherently self-reinforcing or self-stimulatory. These are behaviors that are not necessarily driven by external factors, so not necessarily a tangible item or attention, but it's because they find them intrinsically enjoyable or satisfying. So those repetitive movements we know, like rocking or vocalizations or hand flapping, are all examples of these things. But on this slide, so that's a lot of words to say, but if you really think of those 4 functions of behavior, it really boils down to 2 primary functions. One is a behavior to get something, or to get away from something or have something get away from them, right? So even when you think of self-stimulatory behaviors or self-reinforcement behaviors, those are still something that is to gain something, which is a feeling of satisfaction. That the feeling itself of the reward of engaging in the behavior is why a student engages in it, right? And the same thing is thinking about if you go up to access to a tangible item that we were talking about, that's something to get something. Attaining attention is to get something. So really only the first of the four we were talking about is escape avoidance, is to get away from something. But in trying to understand the function of a behavior, it helps guide the development of effective interventions because we're taking into account the potential reason based on our observations that a student is engaging in something. So if I were to give an example, just to think about this, on the left-hand side, you see examples of positive reinforcement are those examples of getting access to something. It could be an activity. Maybe it's a want for an environment. So when we think about students with autism, there might have some stimulation or stimulatory issues that make them want to gain access. So technically it might be avoidance of one environment to get to an environment that might be more reinforcing to them, to gain a sense of safety or power or control over one's circumstances or to cope with a situation. Gaining social approval, interaction, or a good feeling, like we said, that sensory need is an example of gaining something, versus negative is trying to escape or avoid something, an environment, a person, a task. A social attention for some, there's something they may not like. They're trying to get away from it or escape overwhelming sensory stimulation. So then maybe seeking to ultimately self-regulate. So when you're thinking about the function of a behavior, sometimes it can get really complex and deep when you're thinking, if a student is trying to avoid an environment, they may be trying to self-regulate, and that's sort of the communication of I'm feeling overstimulated or overwhelmed and something needs to change, and I'm going to make it change for myself because I would like for this sensation to stop, right? Which is sometimes why it's easier to think in terms of these two rather than four, because it ultimately does kind of group itself into to obtain something or to get away from something. And helping us understand that helps us develop appropriate interventions to directly address the underlying function. And that means our interventions will be more successful. Because, for example, if we have a child, if we're not necessarily thinking about a disability status or label, you have a student that's engaging in attention-seeking behavior. If you don't become aware the purpose of that behavior is to seek or gain attention, you won't be identifying appropriate interventions, because an intervention in that case needs to focus on teaching alternative, appropriate ways to gain attention rather than accidentally reinforcing inappropriate behavior. That behavior will not change if we don't think that the purpose is to gain attention. And let's say that student's in a classroom and they're engaging in behaviors and teachers are accidentally or inadvertently giving them the reinforcement they're seeking by giving them negative attention. Any type of attention in that case is attention, and that's the desired outcome. But when we can gain control of that and know that a student wants attention, you can start to reinforce appropriate attention only and change those behaviors. It's a more proactive approach essentially to addressing behaviors rather than only focusing on reacting to a behavior. It allows us to be much more diagnostic in what we're providing and when to address the underlying motivations and needs. So, an example of something else to consider that we'll dive into more deeply next week is also thinking there are some antecedents to behaviors that allow us to get more specific to thinking about what happened immediately leading up to a behavior that tells us maybe it was a student getting ready to engage in a self-control function or trying to escape or avoid something. It could be a sense of fear or failure or shame or power, anger, or just to maintain self-esteem, or like we said, it becomes self-stimulatory or overstimulation and the need to remove ourselves, then we can become even more aware of how the environment or other variables play a role in students' behaviors. These behaviors do not occur in a vacuum or all on their own with no reason behind them. So we have to take all these things into account. So next week, we're going to be diving much more deeply into some of these interventions and how we use this information about functions and antecedents to develop some targeted interventions related to what we know as best practice for interventions and services related to behaviors in students with autism.